And that seems a very strange form of empowerment, to insist on policies that help the few and actually harm the many.
What are the current problems with the Black economic empowerment policy framework? Is it genuinely helping to uplift poor people from poverty, or is it just a policy of elite enrichment and capital accumulation? Well, in this extract from a longer conversation on my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara, I sat down with Anthea Jeffery, the head of policy research at the Institute of Race Relations, to discuss why BEE isn't working and what alternatives there might exist to the BEE policy. So, Anthea, let's start with understanding BEE itself. How did it come about? What is it intending to achieve? And what are some of the problems and limitations of the policy?
Well, that's a big question, but let's really go a little bit back into the history, just for context, that by the end of the 1960s, the South African economy had grown so fast that it was clear that the white population was not large enough to meet the needs of that economy. And so business leaders increasingly put pressure on the National Party government to improve Black education and also to allow more Black people to be appointed to supervisory and managerial posts. And from 1973, John Vorster, the then Prime Minister, said he would no longer stand in the way of that kind of Black advancement. And so we did see improvements to Black education. We did see many more Black people coming into more senior positions and a significant increase in Black earnings and so on. And that process, of course, accelerated after 1994 when a Black government was elected into power. And many of the biggest enterprises in the private sector embarked on what they called a soft form of affirmative action. Their aim was to fast track the training, the mentoring of their Black employees so that as many as possible could move into middle and senior positions, but in an organic way and in a way that made sense to all the individuals involved. The government seemed to become impatient with that approach. It decided that we needed to have legislation. So we had the Employment Equity Act of 1998, which came into force in 1999. And this talks about racial targets, but now these are racial targets which have the backing of sanctions, punishments behind them, quite substantial fines at this point, up to 10% of turnover, which is a massive penalty for repeat offenses. So effectively, what had been an approach aimed at trying to speed up Black advancement in an organic and pragmatic way became overtaken by policies aimed at penalizing business if they didn't meet particular targets, effectively quotas. Now the government is going further, and it wants the Minister of Employment and Labour to have the possibility to set what those targets should be for business in different sectors, and that's under the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, which is now before Parliament. In the BEE sphere, you saw something rather similar, with the first BEE ownership deals being done before 1994, in fact, with some of the big corporations transferring subsidiaries to Black investors on preferential terms. Again, the government began to indicate that this was not enough, that it wanted not only deals, but also a big emphasis on preferential procurement, that the state would use its purchasing power to make sure that many of those contracts went to Black businesses. And this was enshrined in law again, in the Black Economic Empowerment Act of 2003, and also in a Preferential Procurement Policy Act, which came in 2000. So now we had, on top of the steps that business was taking in any event, two major legislative interventions, the Employment Equity Act and BEE in its various dimensions, but with the most significant probably being the BEE deals and the preferential procurement. And the IRR is well aware that where these kinds of affirmative action policies have been applied in other countries, where they use race or ethnicity as the foundation for them, what generally happens is that a very small pool of the most credentialed people, generally the most skilled, the most politically connected, are the ones who benefit from these policies, and the great majority do not. So here in South Africa, we wanted to find out whether the same sort of dynamic was playing out. And the best way to do that is actually to go and ask ordinary people, what is their experience of employment equity and BEE? So we've been commissioning opinion polls from a very reputable agency, Mark Data, for a number of years. In 2015 and 2016, we asked people, Black respondents, what's your experience? And we found in rough terms that 15% said that they benefited either from employment equity or BEE deals or contracts, and 85% said they did not. So again, a confirmation that the benefit of these policies, which the ANC posits as the only way in which Black people can advance, is going only to a small group, and the great majority are not benefiting from them at all. So there's a sort of irony that the ANC denies what was in place, what was happening for decades before 1994, and was continuing on an organic basis. It wants Black people to be grateful for the race-based laws that it has introduced, which it says are the only foundation for upward mobility, contradicting the experience of the past. And it refuses to acknowledge really the fact that those laws only benefit about 15% of Black South Africans, and the remaining 85% simply have no opportunity of getting access to the management jobs or the BEE deals or the preferential tenders from the state or others. And so we have, in fact, a widening inequality within the Black population, with a small number of millionaires and billionaires, and at the same time, more than 9 million Black people who are unemployed and have, of course, a situation of almost no income, perhaps some reliance on social grants through children or parents, but really no capacity to earn their own living. And that seems a very strange form of empowerment, to insist on policies that help the few and actually harm the many.
Enjoying this analysis? Click here to sign up for our 30-day free trial for more content from the CIA.
One of the problems is that it engenders a sense of dependency on the state. And as you argued, the ANC, it's in their interest to portray economic advancement as being conditional on government intervention rather than through pursuing the profit motive or through developing products or services that help people or of value to consumers. So, I mean, there's this problem of elite enrichment, and that's obviously driven by a political interest. But what are some of the other ways in which the political class in South Africa kind of perpetuates this idea of BEE?
Well, it's the most politically connected that benefit the most. So obviously there's a strong vested interest there. And if you want to give a most practical example, we can think of Ace Magashule's, one of his sons, who last year was able to obtain a PPE contract for the supply of face masks and soap to the Free State Provincial Administration, where his father had been premier for many years. And within a week of that contract being awarded to his company, of which he is the sole director, he was able to go out and buy a 2 million rand BMW, which creates all sorts of questions as to whether the pricing was correct, whether there had in fact been the fraud and inflated pricing of which the National Treasury has often expressed concern in the context of preferential procurement. So we have people who are politically connected being obviously the ones that benefit. There's a concern as well that some of the kickbacks from contracts flow back to the ANC, help to sustain a patronage machine which keeps the party in power, helps to keep its cadres happy. And yet we see at the same time an enormous damage to ordinary people. In fact, it's not just that they're being left out, it's worse than that. You know, take again, I beg your pardon, the Ace Magashule contract. If the prices were inflated, then obviously the Free State government then has less money left over to contract with somebody else for the supply of face masks and so. So the people who most need the benefit of those goods and services are in fact being shortchanged. Too much money is going to a small group of people and not enough is left over to meet all the other needs through contracts concluded on a more economic and cost-effective basis. So we have the problem there very much of entrenched interests. There are probably also ideological reasons why the government is very committed to BEE. But it's really important against this background to try and think about whether there are alternative ways of trying to empower people and what ordinary people think of them.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this discussion, you might want to check out the full conversation with Anthea on my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara. Here we go into more detail about alternatives to race-based affirmative action and how to meaningfully uplift poor people from poverty. My name is David Ansara. This is the Center for Risk Analysis. Until next time, take care.